The most humiliating moments of your life probably happened right when you were absolutely certain you had everything under control. We love that ridiculous fantasy, the idea that we can predict every twist, every curveball, every ounce of chaos the universe decides to dump in our lap on a random Tuesday. And nobody illustrates that fantasy better than a swordsman named Sasaki Kojiro. If the name doesn't ring a bell, Kojiro was one of the most celebrated duelists in feudal Japan, a master of a razor-sharp technique, a spotless reputation, and an ego the size of a prefecture. He trained under a school known for a strike called the swallow cut, modeled after the impossibly fast turn a swallow makes when it's cutting through the wind. Translate that into modern terms, and Kojiro was basically a guy who trained so obsessively that he came to believe he'd tamed reality itself. He'd fit right in today, posting slow-motion videos titled 5 Samurai Habits That Will 10 Times Your Discipline. Then along came a wandering, unwashed swordsman named Miyamoto Musashi, who didn't just beat Kojiro in the most famous duel in Japanese history. He dismantled his entire worldview. And that's really the story underneath the story. Overthinking is not intelligence. Overthinking is ego wearing the costume of strategy. It's the guy who spends 3 years researching how to start a YouTube channel and never uploads a single video. It's the person who builds 12 spreadsheets before starting a diet they'll abandon in 5 days. It's the poor soul who opens 47 browser tabs to make one simple decision and ends up more paralyzed than when they started. Kojiro was all of that in one body. A warrior who genuinely believed that thinking harder meant fighting better. And life, with its brutal sense of humor, was about to prove him spectacularly wrong. Here's how it happened. Kojiro shows up early, immaculate, blade-oiled, posture perfect, the picture of readiness. And then he waits, and waits, and starts to seethe. This, right here, is the first unmistakable symptom of a mind that thinks too much. The inability to tolerate reality behaving differently than the version you rehearsed in your head. It's the same energy as the guy at the coffee shop chess table who burns 30 minutes analyzing moves that will never actually occur on the board because the real opponent isn't across the table. It's the story running in his own skull. Musashi finally strolls in, hours late, carrying nothing but a wooden oar he'd carved into a makeshift sword on the boat ride over, and casually informs Kojiro that he's already lost. Kojiro does what anyone drowning in their own head does. He explodes. Not because he was weaker, because his perfect plan had just been vandalized by reality, and he had no idea how to fight an opponent who refused to follow the script. That's the trap, and it's not a medieval one. It's universal. The instant something breaks from the plan, people who've built their identity on control simply come apart. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche spent a lot of ink on exactly this weakness when he described what he called slave morality. The mindset of someone who needs absolute order, absolute predictability, absolute safety before they can function. The strong, he argued, don't need any of that. They embrace uncertainty because they understand it's the only thing life ever actually guarantees. Kojiro was the first kind of man. Musashi was the second. And before you get too comfortable feeling superior to a guy who died 4 centuries ago, you do this too. So do I. So does basically everyone walking around with a smartphone. We've all bought into the delusion that thinking more equals living better. and it produces an army of modern-day Kojiros everywhere you look. The student who spends 3 months hunting for the optimal study method and never opens the actual textbook. The gym goer who watches more fitness content than he actually lifts weight. The employee who reads a dozen productivity articles before finally, reluctantly, answering one email. And the classic universal one. You write the perfect text message, rewrite it 10 times, agonize over the punctuation, and the other person replies with a single lol. Life laughs at us the exact same way it laughed at Musashi showing up late. The good news buried in all this humiliation is that real focus was never about control. It's about something else entirely. Something Kojiro never had, and Musashi had in abundance. Kojiro didn't lose because Musashi was the superior technician. Kojiro lost because he trusted his own head too much. Overthinking, it turns out, is just a more sophisticated way of sabotaging yourself. So, let's talk about the concept that broke Musashi wide open, the one that would make half the modern internet short-circuit, Mushin, which roughly translates to no mind. And no, this isn't the lazy, glazed-over kind of empty you'd use to describe your uncle after 4 beers. This is something else entirely. Arguably the most dangerous, most efficient, and rarest state a human mind can reach. Musashi didn't invent this out of thin air. He pulled it from a deep well of Zen Buddhist thought, a tradition built around meditation, non-attachment, and mental discipline, traced back to figures like Bodhidharma, the Indian monk credited with carrying meditative practice into China, and later shaped by teachers like Dogen, who founded the Soto school of Zen in Japan. Their shared insight was simple and brutal. The mind only performs at its best when it isn't clogged with garbage. In a state of Mushin, you don't overanalyze. You don't manufacture drama. You don't run 20 hypothetical futures on a loop. You simply act, with the precision of someone who has nothing left to prove to anybody. Now look at where we are today, and the comparison is almost too sad to be funny. We live with our heads stuffed full of noise around the clock. Notifications, other people's opinions, gossip, clickbait, tweets, fear about a future that hasn't happened, guilt about a past that's already gone, and that relentless inner monologue that sounds like a drunk narrator actively rooting against you. It's like every person alive is carrying a personal radio station, broadcasting the worst top 10 countdown imaginable. Am I falling behind? She posted another beach photo. My life is a mess. What if nothing I try works out? Did that reply sound cold? What if everything actually does work out? Would I even know what to do with that? The bus is late. Am I going to die today? I'll start the gym on Monday. And that's before lunch. Meanwhile, Musashi was doing all this 700 years before smartphones existed, before group chats, before a single notification had ever buzzed in anyone's pocket, and he was already telling people to empty their heads. If his contemporaries struggled with that advice, we're in far worse shape. Most of us can't sit with our own thoughts for 90 uninterrupted seconds. But don't mistake this for an invitation to become a houseplant. Musashi wasn't selling passivity. He was pointing at something sharper. And this is where the real poison of overthinking hides. Thinking itself was never the enemy. Thinking about the wrong things, obsessively, is the enemy. Musashi wasn't a serene monk folding paper cranes by a quiet river. He survived dozens of duels where losing meant dying. His version of Mushin was ruthlessly practical. When he talked about emptying the mind, what he meant was strip away everything that keeps you from doing what needs to be done. That includes your ego. It includes your self-pity. It includes obsessive fear, exaggerated interpretation, stubborn expectation, that sickly need to appear clever, and the exhausting inner theater where you win arguments that never happened with people who were never listening. You find echoes of this idea everywhere. In ancient Greece, Stoics like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius wrote about ataraxia, the inner calm you win once your emotions stop running the show. In modern psychology, the researcher Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who coined the term flow, described a mental state in which your attention becomes so completely absorbed in an action that self-consciousness simply evaporates. Musashi was describing that same phenomenon 400 years before it had a name in a psychology journal. And here's the twist. Today, the real enemy of Mushin isn't even thought itself. It's something more irritating. We have unlimited access to information, and somehow we've never been more scattered. Not scattered in intelligence, scattered in attention. A 20-minute cartoon episode can carry more genuine philosophy than most people's entire mental life. Take a character like Rock Lee from the anime Naruto, not gifted, not a prodigy, no natural talent to speak of. What he has is a focus that borders on fanaticism. He is essentially walking Mushin, action, with zero distraction. Meanwhile, the rest of us pause the episode 3 times to check our phones. The modern world has managed to turn almost everyone into an emotional overthinker with the attention span of a goldfish. If Musashi were alive today, he'd probably get flattened by a bus while walking down the sidewalk, too busy staring in disbelief at an entire city of people hypnotized by 4-inch screens. He wasn't preaching emptiness as some kind of minimalist aesthetic to post online. He was forging emptiness into a weapon. And here's the thing. We're at war too. Ours is just invisible. It's a war against an endless current of stimulation, trying to hijack our attention, our peace, our sense of direction. Mushin says it plainly. Think too much, and you stop acting. Stop acting, and you stop living. The world isn't going to destroy you for lack of intelligence. It's going to destroy you because you thought so much, you forgot to actually exist. Now let's talk about a wound that heals you the moment it's opened. You have too many preferences. Not normal preferences like liking your rice fluffy instead of mushy. I'm talking about a genuine modern affliction, something close to preference addiction. That childish insistence that the world arrange itself precisely the way that feels most comfortable to you. And before you reach for the easy defense of, well, that's just human nature, let me remind you, Musashi was already dismantling that excuse 4 centuries ago. He understood that excessive preference is simply fragility, wearing a fancier outfit. Trying to control the world through preference is like trying to fence with the wind. Make no mistake, Musashi wasn't some delicate philosopher scribbling in a scented cabin somewhere. He was a man who'd walked away from more life-or-death duels than most people have walked into gym memberships. If anyone on earth had earned the right to be particular, it was him. And yet, in the Dokkōdō, the 21 precepts he wrote in his final days, shortly before his death, one of the very first lines reads, roughly, "Do not, in general, have any preferences." That line came from a man who spent his life between blades and stillness, blood and silence. He said it because he knew something most people never figure out. Rigid preference is weakness wearing armor. You know who else arrived at a version of that same idea? Jean-Paul Sartre, the French father of existentialism. Sartre argued that reality has zero obligation to follow the script running in your head, and the harder you try to force it into your preferred shape, the more you suffer. He called the alternative pretending reality owes you a certain outcome. Bad faith. The act of fleeing from what's real by inventing a fiction about who you're supposed to be. Swap Sartre's fiction for Musashi's sword, and you land in the exact same place. Wanting things isn't the problem. Believing that wanting gives you any actual power over the outcome, that's the problem. Let's be honest with ourselves for a second. Most of what you call preference is actually dependency in disguise. You don't merely prefer good Wi-Fi. You depend on it to avoid turning into a feral animal by 3 p.m. You don't merely prefer to be understood. You depend on it to avoid an existential meltdown. You don't merely prefer your plans to work out. You depend on that to maintain the illusion that you're in control of anything at all. Modern life has quietly turned ordinary people into emotional royalty, demanding that every detail line up with the exact feeling we've decided we're entitled to. And the second it doesn't, we spiral. Drama, insecurity, anxiety, a paragraph-long text message nobody asked for. Musashi would watch this unfold from a distance and simply say, "You've already lost." The more preferences you carry, the more of a hostage you become, because every tiny deviation from your script now has the power to wound you. Think back to Kojiro at the duel. His preferences were so rigid that one single unscripted detail, Musashi's lateness, was enough to turn him into a walking bomb. He was defeated before the swords ever crossed. That's how the real world works too. Everything you cling to too tightly weakens you, because life is never, ever going to hand it to you exactly as ordered. In Zen Buddhism, this is called attachment, and in the West, the man who did the most to popularize the idea was Alan Watts, a British-born philosopher who spent his career explaining why we suffer so much trying to grip things that were never meant to be gripped. Watts had a famous line about trying to hold water in your fist. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it escapes between your fingers. Musashi's version would probably be blunter. Your problem was never the water. Your problem is your ridiculous hand trying to own it. But here's the relief on the other side of all this. If preferences make you weak, the absence of them doesn't leave you hollow. It makes you dangerous. Musashi's real advantage, the thing that let him beat entire established schools of swordsmanship, was adaptability. He had no favorite technique, no fixed style, no sacred ritual he clung to. He watched, he adjusted, he struck. You see the same principle in modern sport. Take Kobe Bryant, nicknamed the Black Mamba, for his near-pathological drive to win, who studied every possible style, every possible opponent, refusing to marry himself to one way of playing. He didn't have a preferred style. He had an obsession with winning, and he let that reshape everything around it. Preference builds a cage. The absence of preference builds freedom. This isn't a call to become an emotionless robot who likes nothing. Nobody's telling you to stop enjoying things. The real distinction is simpler than that. Liking something is human. Depending on it is fragility. And most people today are quietly dependent on dozens of tiny things they've never even named. The coffee can't be too hot. The delivery can't be late. The crush can't take too long to text back. The boss can't push too hard. The algorithm can't ignore the post you worked hard on. You've handed your own sanity over to a list of variables you don't control. Musashi had a phrase for this: straying from the path. Your preferences don't actually reveal who you are. They reveal how much the world has to bend before you fall apart. And the world, frankly, isn't interested in bending for anyone. Now, let's talk about ego, impulse, and the decisions we all swear were perfectly rational. Time for an uncomfortable truth. You are not as rational as you think you are. That's one of the oldest psychological tricks in existence, far older than Musashi himself. The human mind behaves a lot like an intern who makes a mess all day and then dresses it up in fancy language afterward, presenting the chaos as if it were a carefully calculated strategy. Ego, impulse, fear, pride, petty emotional revenge, all of it puts on a suit, calls itself logic, and you fall for it every time. Welcome to the club of the modern overthinker. Musashi figured this out disturbingly early. He understood that before you face any opponent out in the world, you first have to face an entire army stationed inside your own skull. And that army is disloyal, over-emotional, and absolutely loves making impulsive decisions while pretending to be a brilliant general. Ego isn't the same as self-esteem. Ego is the voice that always insists it's right, always needs to be right, and always feels persecuted by the smallest slight. It's an internal Kojiro, permanently furious about lateness, small details, other people's opinions, and disrespect that mostly exists only in its own imagination. Musashi treated ego as an intimate enemy because ego overthinks constantly and underacts constantly. It's busy protecting your image instead of protecting your life. Modern psychology backs this up almost word for word. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate behind Thinking Fast and Slow, demonstrated scientifically that the human mind fabricates rational-sounding justifications for decisions it already made on pure emotion. You feel first. You invent the argument afterward. Kahneman simply put into a research paper what Musashi learned the hard way, at the edge of a blade. Which brings us to the sneakiest character living in your head. Impulse. The champion of terrible timing. Impulse is what makes you send the text you shouldn't send, spend money you don't have, pick the argument you didn't need to pick, and cling to something that died a long time ago. Impulse is action without focus. Musashi lived by the opposite principle: action without noise. The Greek Stoic philosopher Epictetus, a former slave who became one of history's great teachers of mental discipline, said something remarkably close. The wise person is the one who acts from reason and learns to moderate their automatic reactions. If Epictetus had watched Kojiro charge forward in a blind fury, he probably would have laughed and said, "How easy it is to manipulate an inflated ego." So many of the decisions we proudly call rational are, underneath, just theater. Ask yourself honestly why you made a bad decision recently, and the answer usually sounds like, "It felt right at the time, it seemed logical, I just wanted it to be over." Most of that is a polite lie. The truth is that some immature emotional impulse was steering the wheel, and your rational mind only showed up afterward to write the explanation. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, one of the leading researchers on the connection between emotion and cognition, demonstrated that people who lose the ability to feel emotion also lose the ability to make decisions at all. Decision-making is always a blend, never a pure act of logic. Musashi never used a word like neuroscience, but he understood the principle instinctively. A contaminated mind produces contaminated action. Kojiro didn't lose that duel because his technique was flawed. He lost because he made his final decision in a state of pure impulse, ego boiling over, and his mind clouded with rage. We do the exact same thing every day. Not with swords, but with words, choices, reactions, silence, posture, and pride. Same war, different weapons. But here's a detail almost everyone misses. Musashi never tried to kill his ego. He did something smarter. He tamed it. And that distinction changes everything. The ego never fully leaves. Impulse never fully leaves. Mental noise never fully leaves. But all of it can be trained. Musashi trained the way a man trains when he genuinely believes the enemy inside his own head is more dangerous than any opponent standing across from him. He kept his body and mind disciplined, not for the sake of looking enlightened, but because discipline is what makes you functional. Artists understand this too. Think of Beethoven, deaf, isolated, furious at a world that had betrayed him, and yet still producing some of the most towering work in the history of music. Not because his ego disappeared, but because he learned to shove it into the back seat and let something quieter drive. That's how Musashi operated. Observe, feel it, let it pass, act without noise. He never denied his emotions. He simply refused to let them cast the deciding vote. That inner war will never fully end. And honestly, that's fine. You were never going to become some flawless, purely rational being anyway. Nobody gets there. What you can actually achieve is recognizing the battle for what it is, instead of mistaking your own emotional outbursts for wisdom. The only real difference between you and Musashi is that he could identify the enemy inside himself. Most people just call that enemy my personality. The problem was never your lack of rationality. The problem is believing your ego is rational in the first place. As long as you keep believing that, the version of you fighting from the inside will keep losing every single round. Now let's talk about what actually matters when nobody's watching. There's a piece of any conversation about self-improvement or spiritual growth that people love to skip. The ugly part, the silent part, the part that never earns a single like, the part that smells like failure, isolation, and trying the same thing over and over, with nothing to show for it. That part has a name: pain. And it's pain, more than anything else, that quietly decides who you become when there's no audience left to perform for. Musashi understood this far better than any wellness influencer posing with a Stoicism book at a trendy coffee shop. The man trained alone, traveled alone, meditated alone, fought alone, and wrote his final principles alone, shortly before dying alone. There is no version of real growth that skips the kind of pain nobody claps for. One of the great lies of modern life is that effort only counts if someone else finds out about it. And so, we've built an entire culture around performance. People who train for the mirror, study for the feed, read books for the caption, work for the resume someone else will glance at for 6 seconds. Musashi was the total opposite. He trained alone in forests, temples, caves, riverbanks. No audience, no validation, no applause. Just repetition, sore muscles, frustration, and silence. And it was in that unglamorous dirt that Japan's most feared swordsman was quietly built. You see the same pattern in modern athletes. Take Michael Jordan, a man who didn't invent basketball, but sometimes seemed like he did. What made Jordan terrifying wasn't just raw talent. It was the training nobody saw. Arriving before everyone else, staying long after they'd gone home, running the same drill 1,000 times until his body could do it without his mind ever getting involved. That kind of practice hurts. It exhausts you, and it's exactly what transforms you. Silent pain shapes character. A spotlight shapes nothing at all. And if pain is what shapes character, why do we run from it like it's radioactive? Because pain, endured correctly, becomes a filter. It burns away everything that doesn't matter and leaves you standing with only what does. Go back to the worst chapters of your own life: illness, loss, failure, crisis. And you'll notice that almost everything that felt urgent before those moments simply evaporated. Pain is a brutal filter, and what survives it is what was actually essential the whole time. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, history's most eloquent pessimist, argued that suffering is the true substance of life, not in a depressive sense, but in an honest one. Pain reveals who you are once the mask comes off. Musashi used pain like a magnifying glass. He let it show him what actually mattered, and if something couldn't survive discomfort, it didn't deserve space on his path. And here's a truth almost nobody wants to sit with. Pleasure is easy. Pleasure is anesthesia. Pleasure distracts you, and pleasure is addictive, which is exactly why Musashi distrusted pleasure for its own sake. Not because he was joyless, but because he knew that too much comfort dulls the mind. Pain, on the other hand, sharpens it. It exposes your weaknesses, your fears, your internal lies. It shows you exactly what's been controlling you the whole time. You see this most clearly in art. Frida Kahlo, the Mexican painter, took a lifetime of physical and emotional agony and turned it into work that still stops people cold today. She didn't paint happiness. She painted fracture, loss, limitation, raw and unfiltered truth. That's precisely why her work is unforgettable. Musashi didn't paint his pain onto canvas. He fought through it, and in the final chapter of his life, he wrote about it plainly. But there's a crucial distinction between suffering pointlessly and suffering on purpose, and that distinction is what separates Musashi from most of us. Not all pain builds you. A lot of what people suffer through, jealousy, wounded pride, comparison, unmet expectations, is what you might call cheap pain. Musashi chose the expensive kind: discipline, solitude, repetition, training, focus, and renunciation. It's the same principle that turned Bruce Lee, martial artist, philosopher, and one of the most influential figures of the 20th century, into a legend. Lee trained with an intensity that bordered on obsession, but it was pain with a purpose, pain in service of freedom. He famously said he didn't wish for an easy life, but for the strength to endure a difficult one. That is Musashi's philosophy, almost word for word. Intentional pain burns off distraction. It sharpens you. It forces your attention onto what actually counts. You'll never discover your real focus, while everything around you stays comfortable. Comfort is the territory of illusion. Pain is the territory of clarity. When nothing hurts, everything feels important. When everything hurts, only the essential survives. Musashi didn't arrive at his philosophy through books or travel or daydreaming. He arrived at it by bleeding, losing, failing, and training relentlessly. That's where you actually meet yourself. Pain isn't your enemy. It's simply the one part of your life with zero patience for your illusions. Ignore that lesson, and you become another Kojiro. Learn it, and you become something the world has to take seriously. Which brings us to the final piece. Staying locked onto your path all the way to the end, the way someone commits when there's no backup plan waiting in the wings. This is the line that separates people who live half-heartedly from people who actually leave a mark. Not the flimsy, trendy version of focus that lasts exactly as long as it's convenient and dies the moment life applies real pressure. I mean the kind of focus Musashi simply called the way. Here's the ironic part about talking about focus in the modern era. Almost nobody actually has any. Everyone believes they're focused, but underneath, most people operate like a browser with 40 tabs open, flashing, buzzing, competing for processing power, quietly grinding the whole system to a halt. Musashi ran on one tab. Everything else was silence. That idea terrifies most people because it demands something almost everyone actively avoids: having no plan B. A backup plan is often just a polished way of saying, I don't fully trust myself. And before you get defensive, the issue was never having options. The issue is treating your options as an emotional crutch that lets you avoid ever fully committing to anything. Musashi never would have defeated dozens of established masters if he'd been carrying around the quiet insurance policy of, if this doesn't work, I'll just try something else. For him, a backup plan was simply an excuse to hold something back from Plan A. You see this same total commitment in historical figures who genuinely changed the world. Marie Curie, the Polish scientist who discovered two chemical elements, won 2 Nobel Prizes, and effectively opened the door to modern physics, didn't have a Plan B. She worked in a leaking shed, absorbing radiation she didn't fully understand yet, losing years and her own health, because that single pursuit was the only thing that made sense to her. There was no, I'll study something else if this doesn't pan out. Or, look at Malcolm X, whose entire life was one radical transformation after another. He didn't have a fallback for his cause. He had direction. He had a path. That's exactly why people like this end up in history books instead of statistics. The path doesn't need to be pretty. It needs to be clear. And here's Musashi's real secret weapon. Focus was never stubbornness. It was conscious consistency. He didn't stay on the path because he was obsessive for its own sake. He stayed because the only alternative was living without direction. And for him, that was a far more humiliating death than any blade could deliver. The path is something you choose. It's not something the world hands you. And here's where a figure the modern world loves to misread comes in. Friedrich Nietzsche, who introduced the idea of amor fati, loving your own fate. Most people misunderstand this as passive acceptance, as if it just means shrugging and letting life happen to you. What it actually means is closer to the opposite. Since you're alive, live with intensity, with direction, with intention. Step into your own life the way you'd step into a final duel. That was Musashi's entire existence. He wasn't a romantic wandering around with a sword for aesthetic reasons. He was a machine built entirely out of focus. Let's be honest, most people never develop real focus because they're not willing to pay its emotional cost. Real focus means losing things. It means saying no to momentary pleasures, sitting with discomfort, getting frustrated, spending long stretches alone, enduring boredom, being judged, and risking genuine, humiliating failure. Most people would rather live in the almost, because almost protects you from the sting of actually failing. But it also guarantees you'll never become someone who truly matters, even to yourself. Musashi wasn't afraid of failing. He was afraid of living without ever really fighting for anything. And here's one last thing almost nobody says out loud. Focus doesn't protect you. Focus exposes you. And that's exactly why it works. When you have a genuinely clear path, you're completely out in the open. There's nowhere left to hide, no ready-made excuse, no distraction left to blame. It's just you, your direction, and life testing your patience, your endurance, and your conviction. The great artists of history understood this. Vincent van Gogh, the Dutch painter who lived poor, sick, misunderstood, and largely invisible during his own lifetime, sold exactly one painting while he was alive. One. He produced hundreds more anyway, because painting was his path, and even though almost nobody understood it at the time, he did. That is what turns an ordinary person into something closer to a force of nature. Focus was never a guarantee of an easy life. It's a guarantee of a meaningful one. Never stray from the path, even when the path turns ugly. And know that the world will try to pull you off it every single day. Other people, your own desires, distractions, setbacks, fear, uncertainty, and the sabotaging voice inside your own head. And still, the final line of Musashi's own writings comes down to this: never stray from the path. not because he believed you'd somehow become flawless, but because he understood that the moment you abandon your focus, when it starts to hurt, you abandon everything. What's left after that is a warrior loaded with technique, loaded with ego, loaded with unused potential, and dead on the shore, having never actually fought the battle that mattered. In the end, focus was never about winning. It was about earning the right to throw the final strike. And the people who spend their whole lives split in a dozen directions are the ones who die without ever finding out what any of it was for.